when fishing places like Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, places like that, I really like to utilize my electronics. This is my first step of my process of finding and locating and catching bass on these big lakes. So, Lake St. Clair, it's a big circle. It's a huge lake. You can get in the middle of it and you can't see the bank on either side. But the one thing about Lake St. Clair is it really doesn't have a lot of features. The bank just kind of tapers down, and then there's one big river that runs down the middle of it. Don't get me wrong, there is contour breaks and things like that, but there's not as many as you would say like on Toledo Bend or Kentucky Lake, where you have true ledges and you have a bunch of them. So one thing that I like to do first is utilizing my electronics. I'm going to run around and find places where it's hard spots and grass, or a mix of the two. Obviously if you find the mix of the two, that's kind of like where they're going to be most of the time. But when you don't have as many features like ledges to look at, what I like to do is run around about 20 to 25 miles an hour and just stare at my electronics. I'm not necessarily looking for a ledge or something. I'm looking for grass, and not just grass. I'm looking for grass that's taller than all the rest of the grass. So you'll start to notice. So when you start running across the lake and you're seeing grass that's right up close to the bottom, a foot to 2 foot off the bottom, and it's just consistent. That's what it is across the lake. And then all of a sudden you see grass that's 3 foot taller, and you'll see a section of it's maybe an acre wide, or on your depth finder you might only see it for 10 or 15 seconds. I'll mark both ends of that grass bed, and what I'll do is once I run over it, I'll just keep running around. I'll mark 10 or 15 places, and then I'll turn around and refish those places where that grass is a little bit taller. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But if you just started just fishing out in the middle of nothing, you probably wouldn't catch as many bass. So if you start really isolating the places that you fish on these big bodies of water, you're going to put more fish in the boat. So that's my first step in my process, is understanding my electronics and marking those places. The next step in my process is drifting across these places or casting to them. When I'm drifting or casting across these places, I want to have a couple different baits tied on. First, I like to have a tube. I don't like throwing a real heavy weight. I'll range my weight sizes from 1/8 to 1/4. This is extremely important when fishing a tube. You want to keep bottom contact, but not too much bottom contact. You don't want it digging in the bottom. And so first I fish a tube. I like a tube, catches big smallmouth. The second bait of choice is obviously a drop shot. A drop shot is just a stone cold killer whenever it comes to fishing for smallies. I always have a drop shot tied on when I'm fishing for smallmouth. And third, I'll have sometimes like a Carolina rig or a fluke tied on, a split shot fluke. I want something to where the bait's kind of floating up off the top or off the bottom, and I want that weight dragging on the bottom. What this is going to do is going to help me find those hard spots. So there are a lot of rock beds in this lake, and I want to find those rock beds that you might not see on your electronics, and that's extremely important. Is to have that Carolina rig or something where you can drag and hit the bottom. You're just going to tick that bottom. When you start feeling a really rough spot, you better hang on, because the rod's about to get yanked out of your hand. So setting up your drift is just as important. I always like to set up a drift to where I don't have any rods on the deck on that particular side, and I'll line my rods accordingly. So I always drift actually on the passenger side of my boat all the time. That's just the side that I like the best. It's the most open. I can maneuver easily. I always set one right beside the console, and then I'll set one on the front deck aiming the other direction. Drift socks are extremely important. If it gets really hard winds, I always tie my drift sock off to the passenger side back corner. What this is going to do is going to slow your boat down tremendously. And when you get in really big water, and like what that can happen on this lake, it can be the difference between getting bites and not getting bites. So when you get in an area where you know that there's some fish, you drop that drift sock, throw out your tube, throw out your drop shot, throw out your Carolina rig. I know 3 rods is a lot, but believe me, I'll start lessening my rods once I figure out exactly what's there. If the fish are, if they're really piled in an area, a lot of times I'll just fish with 1 rod, because when you hook up 3 times on 3 rods, it gets a little bit wild and out of hand. So I really like to start with 3, and the more bites I get, the fewer the rods I go. But I always set that drift sock on the passenger side, back of the boat, and then, you know, I set my rods out, and you got to really pay attention to bait color. So whenever I'm, you know, okay, so what I've done now is I've got a tube, a drop shot, and a Carolina rig. A lot of times I'll actually put a different color on each bait. So, you know, one might have a smoke color or like a natural shad color. The other bait might be a watermelon base, and then the other one might be green pumpkin. And I don't really care which it is. You know, I might put a watermelon tube, a green pumpkin fluke, and a shad colored drop shot worm. I don't think it really matters which one you use, as long as you really try to figure out what color they're on. And you know, a lot of it depends on, is it sunny, is it cloudy, is it windy or is it not windy? But those are all the things that you determine later on once you've experienced it a little bit more. But if you just you isolate the colors to particular techniques, you can really start figuring out exactly what they're eating. In this particular instance, I'm catching a lot on, Perch Colors. So Perch Colors, I started out with a green pumpkin tube, added a little bit of chartreuse and orange to it, and all of a sudden started getting bites on my tube. So what I did then is I actually switched to a green pumpkin drop shot bait and started getting bit on that, and a green pumpkin lizard started getting bit on that. So once you isolate exactly what they are eating, the more bites you're going to get. So that's my second part of my process, is figuring out what that they're eating and having a lot of different rods out there to figure it out. You know, bottom composition is important. You know, what's out there, whether it's grass, rock, gravel. Finding out what those fish are on is just another part of the process of finding the fish on Lake St. Clair. So hopefully you learned a few things today from fishing, or from what I know about Lake St. Clair, fishing Lake Erie on the Great Lakes. And maybe you'll be able to utilize it to put more fish in the boat next time.